Hello, everybody. My name is Aztec Sovereign. Welcome to the Tell Your Story podcast. I'm here today with Netzi and Corey Larson. They're going to be talking about a specific topic that may be a little deep, dark. It has to do with the Mashel Massacre that happened. What were the dates again? The time frame, I should say.
The spring of 1856.
All right. So this is a viewer discretion is advised. It is a sensitive topic that we are going to be talking about. So here's your chance to click off now. But yeah, why don't you guys introduce yourselves? I'll start with you, Nancy.
Annette Bullchild. I am Nisqually Tribal member, Tribal Elder. I am the director of Nisqually Archives and TIPO Department. My family is from the McLeod Kalama background, so I'm here for today's podcast.
Hi, I'm Corey Larson. I'm a historian. I do some historical research for the tribe, and then I'm also an instructor in the Native Pathways program at the Evergreen State College.
And for those of you who don't know, the Evergreen State College is based in Olympia area, or Thurston County area, am I correct? And then, yeah, so like I said, today's topic is on the Mashel Massacre. So what made you guys start researching and really, diving more deeper and trying to uncover the stuff, what happened surrounding that, the Mashel Massacre?
Go ahead, Nancy.
Okay, for me, it was, I had been contacted by a historian, Abby Wanacott, who wrote the book, The Mashel Massacre.
Mm-hmm.
And what she wanted was she had been researching and doing history on Nisqually. She wanted to get that history on some kind of public format. So when I was approached, that was where we worked on the Since Time Immemorial, which is with the Office of Education, So from that point on, all of the history I became aware of through all of her research that she had done. And she lived in the Eatonville area, and that's what she said. She says, I knew when I was there that somebody lived here, there were people here. And that started her research. So for me, learning about the Mashel Massacre in that area became very real at the time. And so working with her, she showed, she talked to me about all of what had happened up there. So to bring that into perspective, none of that was really known before this book was written. It was not talked about because of, what happened there, because the word massacre, that's exactly what it was. So in hers, she worked with students and they retraced all of this history. And even her students were appalled, at what had happened. And so the story needed to be brought out just to know what happened in that area, why it happened. And because of that, the awareness started, but it's hard for people because even when I give people her book to read, they're just like, I don't want to read this, because of, when they first start getting into some of the things that happened. And I said, you have to read it because you people need to know, the younger generation needs to know what our ancestors sacrificed for us to be here, so if it wasn't for them, we wouldn't be here. So there had to be survival included in this. So that was trying to get this story out, and she wanted to do it the best way, with respect to the tribe, but also if it goes into the schools, there was this, do you really want the story to be brought out? Mm-hmm. So we talked about it, and, that's why we had been trying to present it. But I think it is one that needs to happen because this is why people don't know about it. Even our own tribal people don't know about it, and it has to be told just so that they understand this history.
Yeah, and then I know a lot of people say that, if it's not taught, then it'll, history repeats itself. So I feel like in a way that this is, this is a topic that's not really spoken about. I didn't learn about any of it in school myself. I know that's actually something that's actually happening now. Is it? And then, so why don't you say how you got into this as well?
I started researching this topic. It's very long story. By training, I'm an environmental historian, and when I was writing my PhD dissertation, when I initially started, I thought the story I wanted to tell was about sheep on the Nisqually Plains, and then talking about how land use and change over time, and then I read a couple of Cecilia Carpenter's books, and that really changed my kind of framing, because what I thought I was going to be talking about was corporate agriculture in the Hudson Bay Company. What I really found out the story that I wanted to tell was really about relationships and negotiations, and how the Hudson Bay Company the Hudson Bay Company out of Fort Nisqually negotiated with the surrounding indigenous communities, and then how when Americans came and Washington Territory was established in 1853, really at the breakdown of those negotiations, and that's how I really started focusing on the treaty war, and the Mashel Massacre as part of that. So.
All right,
And another part to this is a lot of this kind of came out when Nisqually State Park was established, because that became the area, and so from that you had to go more into the history of that area, and that's the other thing that sparked this. Was then it meant more of this stuff had to come out, that needed to come out, and it was like, do we want to present this at the park? Do we not want to present it? So that was the other thing that happened with bringing attention to this area.
Yeah, so for those who don't know, we're actually doing we're putting up basically signage all around the state park. We're also going to be putting QR codes, little voice, how can I say it? Voice memos, asking questions to actual Nisqually tribal members or community who grew up on the reservation or around the area, talking about stories about the land, stuff about the fish, and also topics on the Mashel Massacre as well, asking what people should know. So hopefully a lot of information goes out regarding that as well. But so let's dive into kind of the story of or the history of what happened. So you said that pork company sheep and whatnot. So how would you say it all began?
Well, I mean, I guess if I wanted to really accurately start, we'd start with glaciers, but I don't think we want to go quite back that far. But I when talking about the Mashel Massacre, I think it's important to start with. Nancy and I were just talking about this beforehand. It really does start with the treaty and American colonization, and how the disruptions associated with American colonization. And so I for me, that would be the place that I think the discussion started. I don't know, what do you think, Nancy?
Well, for me, like I've said before in other events, everything that's happened to Nisqually Tribe and other tribes has been from the treaties, that were not negotiated. They said they were negotiated, but they weren't negotiated. It was like I said, from Remembered Drums, the book Remembered Drums, you'll see the phrase where he says, the Indians were there to sign the treaty, not negotiate. The treaty was already ready. That's how it was for all tribes. So everything in my mind has always been the treaty caused everything, from the war to the internment to everything that's happened to Nisqually tribes that we're trying to bring back. And I don't like the word decolonization, because we didn't colonize. So I like the term re-indigenize, because we can bring back. We'll never get back what we had. But if you go through the treaty and look at it article by article, you will pick out everything that's happened has always been that cause. It's been caused strictly by that treaty. So with the massacre came, they wanted the tribal people to be put off of this land. That's where they were supposed to be put on reservations. But, you know, for Chief Leschi, there was always he was considered a war chief. He wasn't, you know, he was very friendly with the settlers. The war wasn't with the settlers, you know, it was because Governor Stevens wanted them moved to the other reservation where they had no prairies, no river. You know, they wouldn't survive. He knew his people wouldn't survive. That was the reason for, you know, all of this, the war starting, but, you know, it was because of survival. You know, they wouldn't survive if they all had to be moved. So you're cutting off literally their fishing places, their gathering places, you know, they're hunting, you know, because now the settlers are coming in, you know, plowing up the land that once, you know, had their plants, you know, putting fences up to cut off their hunting, you know, their game trails. So there's a lot of this that happened that upset Leschi. And because of that, you know, when the war started, then they had to flee because where could they go, you know? And he knew that. He knew they couldn't go to the places that they fished and get the food. So, you know, with this massacre, there was, and I think Corey had talked about that on one of his, you know, when we did the other with the, I think it was the parks, you know, there was this militia versus, you know, the regular military that, you know, were trained military, and the militia wasn't, you know. So as they're going out, you know, this was where, you know, it said pick up everybody that isn't on the internment. You know, they sent them on these internment camps because they were saying you'll be safe. Well, you know, that wasn't another, you know, a lot of those people were starving. You know, there was starvation. There was, you know, they didn't have the proper clothing. So, you know, like I said, all of this caused from the treaty, that all of this was put into place by really the removal, you know, wanting to remove all of the tribal people off of that land. And tribal people never owned the land. They lived off the land. And that was where Leschi knew survival wouldn't happen, you know, if they were cut off of everything. So people were fleeing, people were running, and, you know, they were going to places that I believe, you know, up at that Mashel area, there was a village because they had to know where to go, you know, to try to get food, to try to survive. And, you know, that's where they were fleeing to. And this was not the warriors. The warriors were at war. This was old men, women, and children, you know, and that's what people don't want to talk about with the massacre, you know, with the military, when the military came in, who they were actually going after, you know, and that's the truth that people don't like to hear.
Mm.
I'd just like to highlight what Netzi was saying there, you know, looking at the lack of negotiation in the treaties. You know, from the beginning, that's what Leschi wanted, was to negotiate. He wanted land on the river. He wanted prairie land on the river, and Stevens wasn't having that. And the Hudson Bay Company chief trader William Fraser told me, who he had been friends with Leschi and Quamuth for over a decade. He told Stevens, he said that he could be a valuable ally or a formidable opponent. And, you know, he basically was telling him, you know, get Leschi and Quamuth on your side. You know, they could be really good allies here. And, you know, told me was good friends with Leschi. And in fact, you know, when he was scheduled to be executed, told me actually wrote a long letter trying to, you know, pleading to the governor for a pardon. But yeah, there wasn't, and that's what Leschi wanted throughout the treaty war too, was just to negotiate and just to get that reservation on the river with prairie lands. And yeah, Stevens was not willing to negotiate. And again, you know, kind of what Netzi was saying there, the distinction between Stevens' militia that he raised out of Olympia and the U.S. military, the U.S. soldiers, which, you know, many of which were at that time were fighting over the mountains over in Yakima country. And, you know, Stevens was taking a very, very hardline stance. And as Netzi said too, when, you know, when they, I believe it was in November of 1855, so that fall, Michael Simmons, the Indian agent, actually, he ordered all indigenous residents in the South Sound to report to internment camps, and basically went and interned all indigenous peoples on the Sound at either Squaxin Island or Fox Island. And then later on that spring, when he was sending people like Maxon out into the field, he actually said that, you know, anybody in your field of operation should be seen as an enemy. And, you know, just that order there, you know, and as Netzi said too, the folks that were up at Mashel that day, they were women and children and elders. You know, that was the bulk of the people up on the Mashel River that day, and they were moving upriver. They were trying to get away from the conflict. And when the soldiers came down, or when the militia came down.
No, so for those who don't know and who aren't really educated on the topic, who is Simmons and who is Stevens?
Oh, so do you want to take that, Netzi?
No, go ahead.
Okay. So Michael Simmons, he was one of the first. He was one of the first American settlers to arrive in the region. They came from the, kind of from the Midwest, and in 1845 came with George Washington Bush and James McAllister and several others. There was a pretty big group that came with them, several families. And when he came, he actually developed a pretty good relationship with a lot of with the Hudson Bay Company and with a lot of indigenous folks in this area. And so, you know, he had a fairly solid reputation with folks. In fact, one Nisqually Treaty signer by the name of the Americans called him Tai Dick or Ilakaka. I don't know if that's the right pronunciation or not, but he said he signed the treaty because Michael Simmons said that Governor Stevens was a good man and that he would take care of the indigenous peoples of this area. And so so Michael Simmons, you know, he knew a lot of the indigenous folks around here. He became Governor Stevens' Indian agent. Governor Stevens, you know, he originally came over here. He was appointed by the president to be territorial governor of Washington Territory and the Indian superintendent. But what originally brought him out here was the railroad survey. You know, they were surveying this area for a railroad, and so as he was finishing up the survey, then he came to Olympia only a year before the treaty. So that's one thing I like to highlight too, is that, you know, here he's coming to as Netzi pointed out, not really negotiate the treaty, but to get the treaty signed. He didn't have a very good understanding of kind of the social landscape of this area. But so he was out here. He came about 1 year before the treaty was signed, and then, you know, that was one of the big objectives of Stevens was to get that treaty signed, because there had been a flood of American settlers coming into this area, into the South Sound, because of the Donation Land Act of 1850. Right, this was the Donation Land Act of 1850 basically said that settlers could come and get land surveyed and make a claim to the land, and then you know, once the territorial government was established and set, then those claims would be acknowledged. The problem was, you know, the territory didn't have title to these lands, right? There was no treaty. These were indigenous lands, and so again, you had people coming in claiming all this land, and it really wasn't theirs to claim. And so, you know, that was one of the big priorities of Governor Stevens, was to very quickly get this treaty signed. And as Netzi said, there wasn't a lot of negotiations. He actually he used the template from a treaty from back east, from a couple of the tribes in Nebraska. He used the Indian superintendent sent that out to him, and he basically, if you kind of compare the treaties, they're very similar in content. So.
Yeah, from what I understand, because it was like that whole, you know, Oregon Trail type thing where everybody was going more west from the east, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, so because when I was hearing the story initially, like, I didn't even realize until you kept saying the dates over and over that this was not that long ago. This was like, what, 150 years ago, basically? 100, yeah. Like, that's two and a half generations, three. Like, basically what I'm thinking is like that they were kind of using the whole, Eastern tribes as kind of a practice run to even take more advantage of, tribes on the West. So I'm just thinking when you said that, excuse me, when you said that people were coming over to the Olympia area or the Cascade region, whatnot, they were saying that they would be given land. And was that, sorry if I space it out, but was that said by Stevens, or was that said by, who was that said by?
Well, the Donation Land Act of 1850, that was by Congress.
Oh, Congress.
Yeah.
So that was like
Yeah,
basically.
It was kind of a precursor to the Homestead Act, the next generation, or the next decade, I guess. 1862, 1863. Yeah.
Jeez.
And so yeah, I think that you talked about Americans coming over here, and this became a very desirable place. Looking at the Nisqually Plains, everywhere from down south of Olympia, kind of Tenino, Rainier area, all the way up to the Puyallup River. That was the Hudson Bay Company. They always talked about just what beautiful prairie lands this was, due to, generations upon generations upon generations of indigenous burning, the indigenous communities burned the prairies around here to ensure regrowth of camas, of bracken, of berries, all that stuff. And so, when the Europeans and Americans walked out onto these plains, they were just astonished at how beautiful they were. And, it seems like every account, whether it be the Hudson Bay Company or the Americans, the first accounts of them, that's the first thing they talk about, is just how amazing these prairie lands are here from, basically the whole South Sound there.
But, the difference with the Hudson Bay and Stevens was Hudson Bay came here strictly to trade. You had a lot of trading going on, with tribes. That's why they were established down where they were at Fort Nisqually. But Stevens, that wasn't his intention. His intention was to get and that was what it's written, to get the indigenous or the Indians off of the land so these settlers could come on. But they were coming on before even these reservations were made. So then that caused conflict, which he didn't step in and do anything about. They didn't move these people off. They were just taking up land, and then they were getting mad because the tribal people were trying to get to their fishing spots, their gathering spots, their hunting spots, and they didn't want that happening. So, that's when the government's like, okay, yeah, we have to handle this, but it wasn't handled in the way it should have been. And like I said, people will say, well, how come, they were friends with Hudson Bay? And it's like, Hudson Bay didn't want to own the land. They just wanted to trade. They built a fort, and that's all they wanted to do. They weren't planning on. Their people did marry, Native women because that was the way of keeping peace, but there wasn't anything of taking over the land and pushing people off, and that's what Stevens' goal was to get that done, with the treaty. And because, like I said, he had the other mission of the railroad. Well, the same thing, you needed land, to have that happen. So he had other priorities, and just doing the treaties was just something that was given to him, which he had no experience in or background, because he was military, he was West Point. So that wasn't his, background. And he did create a commission, I believe, of these people that were supposed to help him. One was a surveyor, but he hadn't surveyed the land. So when they put them on the first reservation, that wasn't even surveyed. The second one wasn't. He was in the middle of doing that. But then, when Stevens had to finally go to Fox Island and do this little speech that he did, that was when he tried to say, he tried to go back on that, saying, we're giving you what Leshai wanted, so the war needs to stop. But that was the whole intent. Leshai's whole intent was to get that, but he still went after Leshai, even after that. So that's where all this gets into the fighting. Leshai wanted peace. He tried twice to get peace and for something to happen, but Stevens wasn't listening. Mason? Charles Mason was the other one that wasn't listening. And so, Leshai, they still, went after him. But that's what he was trying to do, to get his people off of these internment camps back into the land. And when Stevens finally did it, it was mainly because of his, the government was coming after him. His higher up people were, wanting him to settle this and get this done.
Yeah, so it's like the difference between Stevens and the Hudson Bay company, right?
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking of it like this, like, the Hudson Bay Company where renting out an Airbnb,
Yeah.
like at your home
Yeah.
and just staying there for a little bit, that they were trading. And then
Mm-hmm.
Stevens is like, yeah, I'm just going to take it. I'm going to be a squatter for a second.
See, and a lot of people don't really, and that's the other part of that history. A lot of people, these forts were not built as military forts against
just set up camp.
the tribal people. They were built as trading. Fort
Yeah.
Steilacoom was the first military fort that was built strictly military, so people get the wrong impression. And, here we go again with history, all the history not being told. They ended up being military after, the trading was stopped, but that's not what they first started out with. And so that's the part of history people don't read about, is that they just think all these forts were built because they were afraid and wanted a place where, in the movies go that they stereotype it, they ran all these forts so they could get away from the Indians. And it's like, it doesn't work, Carrie. But, there were some, you get it all over, there was groups that were unhappy, there were groups that they talked about, of Indian or Native or tribal people that were going out and doing things, burning settlers' homes and barns and harassing. But that wasn't, Leshai and his group, that's not what they were doing. But that's the part that's written about. The other part isn't written in the history, about him wanting peace and that he wasn't at war with the settlers,
And that kind of, that you can see that in looking at a kind of a timeline of how the war started, in October of 1850. Well, so the treaty was signed in December of 1854, so right at the end of 1854, and then of course Leshai was upset with the treaty from the beginning because there wasn't negotiation. Stevens wasn't willing to negotiate a reservation on the river with access to prairie lands, and so for the next several months, for the next probably 8 or 9 months, Leshai was going around kind of rallying support against it, trying to get support to reopen negotiations. And in October of that year, October of 1855, Leshai and Quaymuth both went to, it was acting Governor Charles Mason at the time, because Governor Stevens was off doing more treaties. And so they go to Governor Mason and try to renegotiate again and try to plead their case to him again. And his response was basically to raise the militia and go and arrest Leshai and Quaymuth. That's when Leshai and Quaymuth moved up to the White River, up on the White River for. It kind of coincided with fishing season as well, and there was protection up in the foothills. So.
And I get a lot of people, other tribal people that, ask, well, Leshai wasn't our chief. Why do we, all these other tribes honor him? And I says, because he went, he had a cause. He wanted, to get this reservations where they should have been. And so when he did that, all the other tribal leaders joined him, and they did back him up and go to war with him. But it was more because of his cause. It wasn't because he was a war chief that just wanted to go create war, but they followed him because they knew what he was doing was right, because they knew the same thing would happen to his people. And so people say, well, the other treaties that were made, like over across the mountains and different places, they had an easier time. I said, yeah, because Leshai went and warned them. He said, this is what they're going to do. This is what you have to look for, don't agree to this, so that was why, people looked up to him, but he wasn't, their chief. So even at the Battle of Seattle, they tried to accuse him of being a part of it. I said he might have been there to support, but I don't believe he went in, he actually went into battle with them. So that's where he got this reputation of being a war chief, which he wasn't, and the reason that's why they followed him was because of what he was wanting, that they get better land, that they, get the place that they're used to, not being pushed onto some other place that, they couldn't do anything with or survive on.
I think too, and you can see that in his strategy too, where, he, right away after Mason, what I always kind of consider this to be a declaration of war, right? When, Leschi and Quamuth go to negotiate with Mason, and Mason responds by raising a militia and sends them out to detain two, federally recognized political leaders. I consider that to be a declaration of war, and so, after that happens, then you see, the coalition that Leschi built. They do a couple of very strategic attacks, and on various targets. The one that he was eventually convicted of murder, Abraham Benton Moses and Joseph Miles, but also a couple others. And as Nancy said, there was the Battle of Seattle. But after each of these, he reached out and tried to negotiate again, right? He after the first in the fall of 1855, he reached out to John Swan, Indian agent out on Fox Island. He reached out to him and tried to reestablish diplomacy and tried to renegotiate. It didn't work. After the Battle of Seattle and in January, he reached out again and tried to negotiate, and there was not much negotiation, and that leads into the spring of 1856, and this is kind of when we're leading up to Mashel. And Leschi, after that second round of negotiations, he realized that there wasn't space. This wasn't productive. There weren't going to be renegotiations. So he actually takes a large group of supporters back over the mountains to kind of regroup and to get support over the mountains, and that's when still there a group stayed here. Groups led by Wahi Lut or Young Jim, they stayed here and they continued doing raids around here, and that was making Stevens. It was making him mad, but it was also making him look bad in the local arena. He was. They were stealing horses and taking supplies and just conducting raids on settler outposts, and that's when he started. That's when he assigns his militia to move up the Nisqually River Valley in the spring of 1856, and that's when he said, everybody in your field is to be considered an enemy.
Yeah, and when you say that Leschi was gathering support, where was he gathering support at? And when you say over the mountains, what do you mean? What mountain?
So he over the Cascade Mountains, but yeah, he had family over there.
Mm-hmm.
His mom was from was it? I heard Yakima and Klickitat.
Yeah, Yakima.
And so yeah, I mean, he had family over there. A lot of his supporters, that were from the kind of the foothills up there in the Cascades, they also had family over there. And so, he's kind of going over the mountains to kind of regroup and get support, because there was fighting going on across the mountains too, right?
Mm-hmm.
You had the Yakima War going on over there.
And then was that also kind of led by Stevens, or was it a lower tier of official?
Well, and here again too, that was part of the conflict too between
Mm-hmm.
Stevens and the U.S. military, on ways to conduct that campaign over there too. So yeah, there was on a couple of different fronts there were.
He was involved. Yeah.
But up in that area, you have to look at it like when we talk about the Mashel.
Mm-hmm.
Leschi did have family over there, and that's what he was looking for, was support. Which they were supportive, but they were dealing with their own, war and treaty issues. But you can see why a lot of the ones that were fleeing that way.
Mm-hmm.
Part of their family was probably over there. That's where they were going. They did travel over there to go and be with their family. So there's a lot of descendants of Leschi over in the Yakima area because of that. But looking at it, you know, that's the reason they were there at the Mashel, you know, when this massacre happened. But with the war going on, Mashel Massacre was actually researched and written, but there was more. You know, when you, as tribal people, are getting their websites or different tribes, all of that is coming out. You know, things that happen with other tribes of the same. I don't know how to put the word in. You know, it was the way the Mashel Massacre happened with which you read about it, and these came from these military or the militia that wrote in there, you know, wrote about what happened. They did interview tribal people from that time, you know, of what they've seen, and because of the trauma that it caused, you know, a lot of people didn't like to talk about it, and that's, you know, that's, like I said, that's why we're here today, because it's not talked about. But I feel it needs to be, because this wasn't the only massacre that happened, you know, for tribal people. There are more that should be brought out, you know, and like I said, it's just like with the boarding school issue, there's more, you know, that needs to be talked about and brought out, and this is just one way. So when they did the exoneration of Leschi, you know, other tribes looked at that and thought, you know, did that help? Well, you know, even for him to get exonerated, it helped because now there was public knowledge of this, you know, the truth came out of all of everything that happened from the beginning to the end. So with the Mashel Massacre, I think it's something that needs to be talked about. It needs to be taught, because there are more stories out there of things that happened that we probably didn't even know. You know, like when they talk about even the Mashel Massacre, even the prisoners that they took, you know, the tribal people that they took as prisoners, you know, they're saying, you know, they had scouts, you know, that were helping them. Well, the scouts were being forced to, you know, a lot of them, that's what they said. They could have been holding their families. You know, there was a reason they were starving. You know, there was a lot of things that were happening in that era that we're not aware of, but that's what could have happened, forcing these guys to do that, to scout, to, you know, to turn on their own people, which wouldn't have happened because, you know, that's not the way tribal people were, but there was a reason for it, you know. So that's why with this massacre, it's just to talk about it and bring it out needs to happen, but it's like, it's a hard, you know, like I tell people, is it something that, you know, people want to hear, people want to talk about? I guess, you know, and my point, what I always try to get through to people is, we will give you the information and the resources, but I think you should go after it and research it yourself. You know, we can tell you all of this, but somewhere along, you have to go in there and really get down into, you know, the whole story and the other stories that can come up from that.
More understand it than,
right.
you know, really hear about it, you know, really dive deep and do your own research and come to a complete understanding.
And it does bother me, you know, with the state park, you know, I get it. I see the reason for it. I see why they want to do this. You know, I understand all of that, but it's hard for tribal people, because the area that's so beautiful, you know, and pristine, there's a reason these tribal people went there. You know, you go to these sites and it's like, wow, you know, this is beautiful. This is, you know, and so you can see that, but then you get the other side of the coin where, you know, there was a massacre there, you know, there was, people died, there was, you know, so it's hard to say, you know, be a part of it without thinking, you know, we should be doing something, you know, you don't want to point directly at, okay, this happened here, this happened there, because you don't want all these people coming and just, oh, I'm going to take a picture, you know, I'm going to show this, you know, that kind of thing. But somehow, you know, when it's talked about, you just need to identify the area to let people know, you know, yeah, this is beautiful. There was a reason that, you know, tribal people came here, but in that, you know, there was this massacre that happened here also.
Yeah, because when people go, you know, over in that area, I've heard stories about people going there to gather some stuff and whatnot, but you can still feel that energy of, you know, there's ancestors here, there's still, you know, spiritual energy over in that area, but it's not exactly like, you know, how people say like, oh, there's bad medicine over there. No, it's basically just good medicine, but, you know, it's like you're there being watched over, protected, and You know, 'cause I'm pretty sure that a lot there's probably a lot more, you know, killings that happened there that we even know about. Because I believe you said how many were reported, quote unquote reported.
Well, so officially reported, you know, by the military was 8.
Yeah, and
8. Well, and if you look at the Pioneer Democrat, which was the newspaper in Olympia at the time, it was 8 hostiles killed.
Yeah.
But then, you know, you get the account. There's one written account of a militiaman that wrote about it, and then shortly after, Augustus Kautz, he fell in with some of the militiamen, and he heard accounts that he said that I don't remember his exact words, like few were spared or very few escaped, and you know the accounts were that there were between 40 and 50 people there, and that were fleeing up the river. So you know,
and the word "some" it's it's not taken lightly as it implies.
But if you look at it also, you have to remember they did this, I think 3 or 4 times. They went back out. So it wasn't, the first time was probably the worst.
Yeah.
But then after that, they kept going out and, you know, supposedly taking prisoners, you know, so, and they said, you know, a lot of them, they think even if there were survivors, they hid, but then the survivors were coming out because they were starving, you know, and it was women and children because, you know, it was women and children, the old men that were together trying to flee because the warriors were all out, you know, at war. They were with Leshai. So who did they have to defend? You know, they couldn't defend themselves in what happened. So that's the part, you know, that I think people find is hard because they're like, oh, you know, how could they do that to these women and children? And it's like, you know, when you're given an order, you know, that's what you do in the military part of it. But, you know, to leave, to do what happened, and like I said, when they're fleeing and, you know, you're just thinking, oh, we have to get them, you know. So in this, I think it was the second, when I think it was Maxson went out, and that's what he said, the bodies were still there, you know. They said because of the fear the tribal people had, you know, of coming back into the area, they were left, you know, whereas tribal people usually took their dead, but, you know, they weren't going back because of the fear that they would be captured. But, you know, they said that the bodies were still there. So they were still recording that, you know, that they were left there.
Yeah, and then from the research that I did, it was along the Nisqually River, correct? Because I heard that there were, you know, men, women, elderly going there to fish and gather and whatnot. So after that, what really? Because you said Leshai was over there gathering support. Him and other tribes were there to, you know, fight against, you know, what was wrong and open up more renegotiations and whatnot. What happened while, I guess, the whole massacre was going on?
So from my understanding, you know, after the, you know, as the massacre was going on, so at that same time, you had Governor Stevens. So there were, I had mentioned that Wahilut and others were still kind of conducting raids down in this area, and then, you know, the militia would chase them, and then they'd get out to about John McLeod's out on Muck Creek, kind of out by right out by Roy, right? And they just disappear, right? And so, you know, again, McLeod, Charles Wren, Smith. There was a handful. I think there was like 5 of them who, you know, they had married Native women. They had married into Native families. They were kind of in these Native communities, and they were you know, they were helping the Leshai's cause, you know, trying to secure the reservation, and Stevens had them arrested, and was going to try them in a military tribunal, and so, basically, and then he declared martial law, and they're basically, giving himself authority to do that, and that was a big political mistake for Stevens. People very quickly down here in the South Sound, they turned against Americans down here, turning against Stevens. He had gotten scolded by his superior for conducting operations like the Mashel Massacre. So he was getting pressure from his boss. He was getting pressure from the people down here. He had no idea where Leshai was, and Wahilud and his group were still conducting these raids and getting away with it. And so, Stevens, he needed this conflict over, and that's when he very quietly went to Fox Island and basically said, what do I have to do to get this conflict over? And again, this is my understanding. That's
Well, a part of that is, people need to understand the communication isn't like it is now. Mm-hmm. Back then, you were communicating by handwritten letter on a ship that took months to get back and forth. So, the people back, his higher ups that were back in DC had no idea some of this was happening when he was, doing all of this stuff. And that's why later when, and I think it was Manny Penny said, told him, he said, that's not what you were put there for. We were put there to help protect these people, get them on these reservations, do all of this stuff. And, not to create this war, but by the time he knew about it, it was later on, and that was where the scoldings came in, and then Stevens had to do the Fox Island speech, about putting them on the place they needed to be. So in that era, there was a whole, because I know people would ask, well, why didn't they put a stop to it if they knew all this was going on? Well, you're not on email, you're not on phone, you're, you're looking at a handwritten letter, and you're at his, whatever he writes, they're believing. So, even with the Indian agents, some of them was the same way. They weren't in agreement with him. And I know on the Fox Island, I think it was Fox Island one, the Indian agent there had said, we need food, we need clothing, we don't have enough. Well, if you don't respond, what is your you look at it going, well, I guess you weren't concerned, because that was kind of your whole idea, is to get rid of them one way or the other, because now they couldn't go back to the land, that the reservations. And if you see in the treaties and that it talks about, they have the option to move them all to one location, and that was the other goal, was to take all of these. So by them not coming off the internment camps, there was less for them to go onto one. It was the same thing. You were just reducing all of that.
Yeah.
So there's a lot in there that I know, people, when it's being taught, will talk about, well, why didn't somebody take care of that? Why didn't somebody do this? But you have to remember, back in that era, the communication and things like that weren't happening like it does today.
And I think that Fox Island Council, that was really important. That was, out of Fox Island, that's where the current Nisqually Reservation was established. That's where Stevens agreed to that. That it was Fox Island that established the Muckleshoot Reservation, and it's because that hadn't been established. Initially they wanted Squaxin Island, where Ptolemy State Park would be the Nisqually Reservation, and then a smaller Puyallup Reservation up there. And so what Fox Island did then was it kept the Squaxin Island. It moved the Nisqually Reservation to its current location, and then it established the Muckleshoot Reservation, and it expanded the Puyallup Reservation. And so that the Fox Island, you see what Leshai's coalition and what his campaign did. It greatly created these new reservations, right? It created the current one, the Muckleshoot, expanded Puyallup. I mean, that was a really important.
So I think part of that message is when that happened, it was, what was the cost, because it cost Leshai his life, for what he believed in. it costs, at the Mashel Massacre, that was a part of the, what happened there happened. But I know, like I said, there had to be other places that these things were going on. It was just this one is what happened in the Nisqually area. But, there's other areas. So there is that, there was always a price to pay, for this. And it was sad that, the tribal people that paid for it, they weren't war people, you were just living life, and I said a lot of these, you look at it, these explorers, all these people, these traders, when they came to this area, they were welcomed by these tribal people. And if it wasn't for the tribal people feeding them, they would have been starved. They just didn't have anything. They provided them transportation, they did all that was needed to help these people. And, this was the price that was paid. Leshai should have been protected at all costs, but that didn't happen, but what he gave, and the settlers did, the ones that he befriended, did try, but, just because of what Stevens wanted, that's what happened. But, like I said, there's a lot of, you read it, and a lot of them say, the tribal people met him on the shores, they traded, they helped him with food, they helped him with canoes, they helped him, even with the horses. There's a lot of that happened that, they weren't just murdered right there when they, came to shore.
Yeah, with the research that I did, there was multiple people who tried to, I guess, fight for, what is the word? Basically to get Leshai, off of the chopping block, or, well, not chopping block, the being pardoned, yeah. I can't remember if it was it Carson who also tried to send a letter pleading for him to be pardoned, or I think there was one person who was like a government official or whatnot was also trying to get him pardoned because he didn't think it was right.
Yeah, I know there were a couple military.
Yeah, it was the one with Couts, maybe?
Well,
I know there was another guy with Couts that
Wool.
exoneration.
Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah, General Wool.
That I heard about. And then there was also citizens, and even the Hangman, he was also saying that he felt like he just hung an innocent man. He was.
And Fort Silicon wouldn't allow them to build the gallows or to hang him on that military base.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted him off the ground.
And that's why they were the site that they just had that walk on by that, in front of that mall or whatever that is. That's where they built the gallows and he was hung. But yeah, a lot of them thought, knew he was innocent, thought he was innocent, believed in him because just of knowing him, so.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just Stevens' own, he just didn't want to.
That was for his own gain.
Right.
Yeah, because he wanted to be like a old bigwig over in the capital, right?
Yep. And so that's like I was saying, there's things that people don't want to know, but it's right there,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not just from the tribal viewpoint, because when you talk about tribal history, it was oral history, so there's not written documents.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're looking at written documents, a lot of them are from, whether it's the military, whether it's settlers, whether who else, they're talking about what happened, from their point of view. And when a lot of the stories are the same, that's what they witnessed.
Mm-hmm.
Even I think his son Hazard Stevens talked about that. He was at the treaty site, and I think he signed the treaty, and I don't even think, was he a teen? I don't even think he was a teenager.
He's a kid, yeah.
So, this is the kind of things that happened back then. Like now you wouldn't hear that, and I've said that on other podcasts, it's like who in their right mind would give up all this land, and sign a treaty like that, when you think about it. But it's stuff that people don't want to hear, they don't want to talk about that. So that's why I said a lot of it hasn't been talked about. And now that tribes are getting more, like this sophisticated equipment and everything and websites, you can bring all of that out and it's there, you can research it yourself and look it up and, if you don't want to believe it, but it's there.
Yeah, and then before, I guess before you really dove deep into it, Netzi, how was this information passed down? Like, didn't you hear about it prior to the research and books that you read? coming from any of the tribal members?
No, and that goes back to the trauma. That goes back to, and it gets back into boarding schools. It gets back, like I said, the treaty started everything. So under the education, became these boarding schools. So these children had to leave, and like I said, everybody should read that boarding school initiative. So the children were forced away from their families, because the parents were told they would be arrested. So they sent the kids to the boarding school. I mean, you're looking at 5 and old, you're not just looking at older children. So to imagine, these kids being taken and split up and all of these things happening to them, their language was taken away, their identity was taken away, they were taken away from their reservation, their families. They were forced not to speak their language anymore. Even the siblings were split up in order that you would speak your language. If you look at boarding school enrollment rolls, you'll see these different variety of tribes. That was purposely done so that they couldn't speak their language, because if you didn't have your own people there, you wouldn't speak the language. So, all of this was gone. And, I would imagine for a parent, there was shame, just to think about it, because I'm like, how do I give my kids up? How can this happen? But, like I said, they were threatened, with jail. And I know even my aunts that went to boarding school, they said, yeah, we started to run away. We knew how to get back home, and, we would take off, but they had to hide them, because when they went looking for them, they couldn't find, they had to put them away someplace. But my mom would always tell us the story of, she asked her mom, why didn't you ever teach us our language and our traditions, and she says, because I didn't want you guys to get in trouble. So they didn't know their language. She says, we knew we had an Indian name, but we don't know what it is. My grandma used to go out in the, she could go out in the woods and gather medicinal plants or, food sorts, she could do all of that, but she would never teach them because for fear they would get in trouble, So boarding schools created that. As people got older, adulthood, there was a lot of the alcoholism, to forget this trauma, but in that they didn't teach, their own anymore because they were in fear of that would happen to them, their own kids and everything. So these things weren't talked about. My father-in-law, my husband's Blackfeet, but he wrote a book, and he wrote it only because he dedicated it to his kids, but he says, I don't think the younger generation will experience this stuff, and I want them to know, our traditions, our ceremonies, and all of that. And you find that with a lot of elders that will say that, we don't want it written down because we used to pass it down, but because that hasn't been picked up, and there's always been this fear of, you're afraid of what's going to happen, you never knew, so that's why you never pass things down. So because of that fear, there's a lot, like I tell people, it's really hard to get elders to talk because that's what they were conditioned to, If you were told you're not supposed to talk about that, you're not supposed. My mom and my aunts used to talk about, going out at night, climbing a tree, and watching their mother, aunts, and uncles, doing these ceremonies because they had to hide in the woods to do these ceremonies. She goes, we didn't know we weren't supposed to be watching it, but we go watch, and see. She goes, but that was how much they had to hide it. When this Shaker religion became about, it was the same way. You went to houses, there was not a church because you weren't supposed to be practicing that, So there was a lot of things that aren't talked about and that weren't passed down because of that fear, that was, instilled in you, especially the older, like I said, my mom and my grandma's, era, because that's, and so you lost your identity. Now, the next generation are curious and they want to know all of this, which is good because they're trying to bring it back. So we're lucky, it wasn't lost, it was lost for a while, but now, it's being brought back. I'm on the Burke Museum, the Native American board, and that's the same way. We have this, dilemma because, the museums, I get it, you're a museum, you get these donations, and so for tribal people, they want them back. These are things that were supposed to be in the ground or supposed to be taken care of, in a certain way, but they're on display in the museum. But at the same time, if these weren't preserved, some of these things we wouldn't have today, So you hear other tribes say, oh yeah, I know what that is. My family used to have these, but we don't have them anymore. There was an Alaskan, it worked at Burke, or worked still there, and he was saying that they found a model of a boat that they constructed. It was a little model. He says, but we didn't make these anymore. He says, but now we had the model, so we could make the full size. So, there's always this that goes on with, I get it, so we get a lot of people now that are trying to donate, these things that their families collected in a good way, to give it back to tribes. But that's the same thing, things were lost back then. And then some of your elders that never talked about it, I couldn't identify them because I was never shown that, those stuff wasn't passed down to me. So that's, a part of this, why there was no talking about it. You didn't pass down, like some people will say, oh, I remember this story and I remember that, but there's not a lot that the history part of it, the good and the bad, that was passed down. You do get some interviews, that you can research and find where these people went out, and they were non-tribal people, went out and really went after, these interviews. And some of it, it's really hard to read, because you look at it and like the things they went through, but they're, wholeheartedly trying to get these, interviews with these people of this history that, they didn't want forgotten, but it's hard to read, but that's the only way it comes out.
Yeah, a lot of the families and just like tribal members were really impacted just for being themselves.
Right.
So it's like, it's crazy to think how, because you were talking about the, boarding schools and whatnot, and then getting punished for basically, just being themselves. And then even my dad, he's not tribal, but he was, even because he's Hispanic, he was even saying to me, like, he didn't want to teach me Spanish because of all the hate and stuff that he got growing up as a kid, being called names and being, basically bullied for being himself as well. So it's crazy to think how, different scenarios or even different cultures, they all face the same, a lot of the same backlash for just being themselves. So
yeah, because that identity is lost. We talked about that, your identity, because
it's like rooted in history.
And when I go to places and have to identify myself, I do identify all of that. It's just because I'm Scottish. I have that in my, I'm part white, so it's, I'm not ashamed, but it's just because of the Hudson Bay. You get this mix. And my nieces, their mother is white, and I says, embrace your white. That's who you are. Don't be ashamed. I used to tell people that as my boys weren't allowed to have a complex. I'm like, what do you mean? And I told them, Indian was in your blood. It doesn't matter if you don't dance, you don't sing, you don't know the language. It's in your blood. Don't let anybody ever tell you you're not Indian. So, having that identity and having what we're trying to get back, that's why I said re-indigenizing helps, because now you're working towards that. It's never, ever going to be the same. We won't get all of our land back. Some of these places, JBLM is one of them that, was taken away, and there's some pretty, on the walk, people see a lot of that, the places, but it's like, there's some things, I still want to fight for, but Puyallup is another that they do trades, because of the land that was taken away. They're like, okay, well, because you took this, we want this now. Other tribes have to do that. So you're really reaching out, trying to get that. I think Puyallup was one of it. They try to save these pieces of land where there's camas growing, and so there's things like that they're aware of and doing now. But yeah, just having your identity and a place, it's really hard nowadays, because a lot of the younger generation doesn't know that. And like I said, there's things that are hard for them to read and understand, to think that really happened. It's like, yes, it did, and it wasn't like it is in the movies. We get a lot of that. People will apologize. I'm like, we're done with those movies.
Yeah.
The stereotype. It's like, don't worry about it. We've already got past that one. We're moving on. So, that's the other thing about with the identity part. People just assume, when you buy land, tribes buy land, oh, they're going to build a casino. And I'm like, we're not building a casino on every corner. But they don't get, the money that has been brought up by the casinos has been allowed, the tribes have been able to buy land back to, increase their land base. But it's also, Native people were the biggest welfare, you know. I said, and now it's helped them to get off of that. You know, we support ourselves now as opposed to having to be under the government's thumb, you know, with health and everything, education. It's like, you know, we have schools, we have, you know, I said, so people don't look at what have you given back to your tribe? You know, now, like I said, tribes have schools. I says, we have a beautiful medical building. You know, these are things that we have because of that. It's not, you know, what you guys think, oh, you're just going to build casinos all over the place. It's like, no, there's a reason for it.
There's a lot of misconception when it comes to that. Because even during school, like I was saying, I was a Native American, and they're like, oh, like, I heard that you guys get money from the government like every month or something like that. I'm like, no.
Yeah.
I'm like, well, it's like tribes, they, you know, they fund themselves, you know, with casinos, with different corporations. We're a whole community that supports, you know, our people. It's like, and then there's just a lot I could correct others on, and that's basically what I had to do.
Yeah, you got government housing now. I says we can have our own housing, you know, we can provide. So it's they just see that part, the casino, but they're not looking at, okay, what has your tribe done? You know, and that's why I said we have websites, you know, go to the website, look at, you know, where we're at, what we've got, because, you know, it's put back into the tribe. It's not just, you know, we just get rid of it. I says there's, you know, and then it gets us everybody off. Like I said, Indian people were always on welfare. You know, they were taken care of by the government. Now we don't have to, so we can, you know, support ourselves.
Yeah, we don't want to be basically still sucking up to the people who, you know, did all that. You know, if you know what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
But I was gonna say, has there been any like ways to, I guess, commemorate the? Do we have any, you know, documentation on the families who were, you know, a part of the massacre?
Not yet, but I think with the Nisqually State Park, that will come about. You know, because of that area. You know, there's a lot of history there. It's just wrapping it. Like when Corey did his presentation, it helped some of the staff to understand. You know, oh, I see how this fits in the war. You know, and that's, like I said, when we go to do any other kind of podcast or speaking, it's like, okay, let's go pre-treaty, you know, because you can't just put it back in the treaty and then start from there. So the pre-treaty, you have to understand what was there before, and that's a part of trying to get back that in the Nisqually State Park. You know, this is what was here before. This is why we came here. This is why, you know, tribes camped here. There was villages here. And then, you know, after that, when the treaty hit and all of this was, you know, taken away, but it's trying to get those stories there so people are understanding why we wanted to be there. And then the same thing with the massacre of how do you bring that about to talk about it, you know, where do you want that to happen? And the same thing, there has to be more research over on the Yakima side to see, you know, did some of these people flee there? You know, were there survivors? You know, we're assuming, because there had to be survivors that witnessed that, and what happened to them, you know, in order to commemorate that, you know, put something up. But yeah, in a way that, like I said, we're all like, because we talked about that. Okay, if you teach this, or you know, if you put this in like even the school system, are they going to want to teach it? You know, the reality about that is
a heavy topic.
Yeah.
But either way, you know, even, I mean, kids learn about World War II and whatnot.
Yeah.
And that's considered one of the darkest times in history, and so and they still teach that. So why can't they teach, you know, about what had happened here?
Yeah, and I guess, you know, looking at it, I mean, it's. This is, we were talking about this before a little bit, it's close to home. You know, I mean, that's, I was telling Nessie, you know, right down the street from me is Governor Stevens Street, you know, it's like, and then, you know, how many schools are named after Stevens in this area? And I mean, so yeah, I mean, and I think it's tough subject, but it needs to be taught. It needs to be brought into light, and man, people need to know about it.
And then here's a question for you, Corey. Where was the first area, or either one of you can really answer? I forgot to ask this during the initial history of the whole Lushai, trying to open more negotiations to where the you know, a better reservation land, basically. Where was the first area located at?
Yeah. So the first proposed negotiation, or actually the first one, they had a map. They had Charles Wilkins' map from Charles Wilkes' map from 1841, and they started drawing on there. But they first penciled in Sequalichoo Creek right over by DuPont, and then they scratched that out because they realized that was in the Hudson Bay Company area that was treaty protected under the 1846 treaty. But then the first one that they proposed at the Medicine Creek Treaty was over where Tolmie State Park is today. That area where, you know, again, it's on the shores, but it's also a high bank. It's wooded. It's rocky, with, you know, no prairie land, no access to the river, and so yeah, that was the first proposed reservation.
And then also the same thing when when you talk about Leschi up in the Mashel area, you know, it is documented that he was born there, raised there, you know, that is a part of that. And that's a part of when you talk about commemorating, it could be done in that way also, you know, that this was a place where he was raised, you know, like I said, there had to be a village there because for people to camp there, there had to be a known site. Mm-hmm. And it's finding that, you know, documentation, you know, specific, trying to find, you know, the right place. But that also can be bringing up all of this, you know, this is why the people that were there, you know, there was a village. She grew up somewhere around there, so there had to be a village. And then kind of maybe working that into commemorating all of the people that lived there.
Yeah. And then I know there's been like a lot of government to government going on. Has there been any I guess, quote unquote, justice or any reconciliation of like what had happened during, you know, has there been any like justice, you know, brought upon the whole massacre? Like
exoneration
any
is about as close
it?
as you can,
yeah,
that I can think of.
Not at the actual site, just the exoneration that would have been brought up. See, and that's what I'm thinking. I think with the state park, that might be something to look into as it's developing, you know, to kind of put that in there and do something like that, because, you know, that's the both sides of it. You know, one with the exoneration, same thing. It was time of war, active war, but then, you know, you get the other side. Well, yeah, you know, they, you know, when they call it treaty wars or Puget Sound War, you know, it's like, what part of it do they want to, I guess, stress? You know, because if you go to Fort Silicon, that's pretty much military.
Yeah.
And it's pretty much Stevens, and they're trying to change that, but it's like, how do we do this? So, yeah, trying to get all this stuff changed. It's a lot. It's because all of these places were made up of old history. You know, like even Mount Rainier will tell you, you know, on our side it was coastal, so they're like, okay, so we need to get rid of the war bond. It's like, yeah, because that wasn't us. The Yakima side, it's fine. You know, the Cowlitz side, you know, is different, but trying to get all these people to understand, you know, all tribes are different. You know, they have different ceremonies, even though, you know, they're all tribal. Some of theirs are similar, but, you know, the languages, all of these are different. You know, you can't just, it's not a one size fits all.
Yeah.
And getting them to understand that is a part of this learning with, like I said, with the Nisqually State Park. Hopefully some of this will come about to talk about our side, because on Mount Rainier, you know, there's the Yakima side, there's the Cowlitz. You know, they have really gone about with theirs, you know, doing that, having all these interpretive places, signs, you know, and that's what we're working on now, and hopefully that will all be brought out. Like I said, I'm not going to read it all to them, but, you know, we want to put this information that you need to go
really
out and do the research. It's there, you know, you need to find it. And like I tell people, you know, my first stop would be to tell you to read the treaty. You know, this caused everything, you know, that happened with tribes.
Yeah. And then, you know, speaking on the, I guess, the whole research part, you know, how do you think that, you know, the whole massacre and everything that had happened between Stevens and, you know, all the government officials and militia, how do you think it really shaped the future of Nisqually?
Well, for me, as people started, like I said, there was no talk because you feared of bringing all this stuff up. Now, as we're re-indigenizing, that's the part that's coming out. That's the part I think that will shape the next generation.
Bringing the
The other
language
generation,
back.
like my mom and my grandma, they had, what they had, but it's something that unless we could, we do have some stories about it, but not a lot.
Yeah.
But for now, it's just getting the next generation to really get into this, the history part of it, which I think a lot of them are doing. Here's Corey, but I mean, that's what they're trying to do. And, in a way that all of this is coming out. Like Cecilia's book's very good. She did a lot of, this woman, we got her collection and we're going through it, getting it ready to digitize. But the things that she kept, it was like every piece of paper, every correspondence, she had a lot of people that wrote to her, that sent her information, valuable things that are happening that my goal is in the archives is to get this out into like the library that people can go in, college students, even the public, can access to, because as she wrote her books, the information is, directed towards her books, but there's more information that she received. There's a lot of correspondence that she kept in with people, but that's a part of this, trying to get this back out, with, like I said, the next generation, to how it will affect Nisqually and shape Nisqually. By the more they know, it'll help them to be the next leaders, of the tribe. Right now, they're still in this, and like I said, my goal for when we did the Since Time Immemorial, getting it on that website, was I had two, my daughter-in-law and my niece, both were in college, took Native studies, and when they asked them, well, tell us about, yourself, so they could do these reports, and my niece was like, I played sports, I don't know. My daughter-in-law, she goes, I know my one side, but I don't know the Nisqually side, and I was like, there's something wrong with this, if we're having college students that don't know their own history and their own background. So that's a part of, making these steps to get it in the public, with the Since Time Immemorial, making, and then it helps the people that do go out and do presentations in the schools, for them to have all of this, the schools, the teachers be able to teach it and have that background, to ask the questions and get all of that. So that's why, I think this next generation, hopefully, once they come to terms with this and do all, have all this history, in my mind, it'll make them better leaders, because they'll understand, like I keep telling them, you need to understand what your ancestors gave up, what they sacrificed just for you to be sitting here at this desk, to be working at the tribe, wherever you're working, there was a lot of sacrifice, but that's where they need that history to understand it, to know this is why I'm here and this is what I need to, because like I said, you don't want history to repeat itself. So they have to have this knowledge to move on and to be able to, this is why I need to learn my language. And I tell a lot of people, when I talk to them, it's like, what are you going to leave the tribe when you're gone? What part of it? It can be any part, but it's like, what are you going to leave the tribe? Because, if you're working in the language, that's good. If you're working in other places, that's, it's the same thing. It's helpful to the tribe. So, and it's getting that, like, I think we have to start picking up where all of these elders, as I call them, left off, like Cecilia, Billy Frank, my mom, previous chairmen, it's like it's our responsibility, and I'll use that a lot in meetings, that's the tribe's responsibility to do this, to get this knowledge out there for, like I said, our next tribal leaders.
And that's basically the whole reason why I wanted to do this podcast in the first place, because the first initial, just hearing about the whole Mashel Massacre in general, it's like, this isn't that long ago. I've never really heard about this, and this is just like a, really good history lesson to, put out to the public. Like, you hear these stories about stuff that goes on with in the Midwest or even the eastern regions of natives, but I don't really hear anything that has to do with tribes and government.
Well, we did a presentation down at the refuge with Willie that was on Mount Rainier staff and the salmon. I don't do salmon, he does salmon. But, that's like he said. He says, we learned about the Battle of Little Bighorn. He says, we didn't know about the Puget Sound War, the treaty wars, So that's the part of it, getting this out there. And once you learn it, it helps you like that. I says, when, you have college students that don't know this, it's like, there's something wrong here, so that's the goal. The more you can at least tell the story, as opposed to, I don't know, I didn't learn that. It's like, well, now you know, and now you have access to all of that, that you can, because of like technology, you don't have to sit and read this big old book. You can just go on the website, and find things. So it's
and then
really
even
helpful.
This now, it'll give you that little glimpse of interest or whatnot to even learn about it from YouTube. While they were looking for Leshai, is there any other place besides, the Mashel area or Nisqually River that they were more massacres going on? Do we know of anything? Because were they killing, the elders, women, and children while they were looking for, correct?
From what I understand, there was some of the same folks that were out at Mashel. Some of the same militia folks were also went down and fought and there was an account of another similar massacre down there on the other side of the mountains too, down in kind of the along the Columbia River.
Okay.
I need to look more into that, but I know that they had talked about, particularly Shaw was down there with them as well, with that group. So that's probably the nearest one that I've heard about.
And I would believe there's more, and that's what I tell people. Don't just look at, trying to read things about Native Americans. I says, read, these military journals, these settlers' journals, all of these people that kept, journals, a lot of them will talk about it. One of the problems you do have when you're reading them, you have to be mindful of is sometimes with the names, we were talking about that, they're misspelled or the way they thought they sounded is that's the way they were spelled.
The
right.
Romanization.
And so sometimes you think it's two or three different people when it's one and the same, so I always tell people, and I was talking to Corey about that, when you write or you put something in writing, put all the versions, because sometimes you think, these are three different people and it can be the same person that they're talking about and they can have a different story, but you don't know it's the same person. So I always tell them, look at everything, when you're doing research, because all of these people, that was their way of, whether it was letters, correspondence or journals, it's there. It's just you have to look for it, in different places.
Yeah. And then, some people may not even know about Leshai whatsoever. When was he exonerated? And what was the date of his hanging?
The exoneration was in December of 2004, I believe.
His hanging, I think, was in 58.
Yeah, February of 58.
Yeah, the second, because when they had to retry him, and then they had to reset.
And then they rescheduled the execution. So there were two trials, and then there were two executions.
So he was actually, and that's what I wanted to. I'm trying to work with Forts to look him on where the site was where he was held, because it looks like he was held at least 2 years.
Yeah.
But he did say the guy that what would he be, the guy that took care of him, when he was in the stockade or whatever, treated him very well, and he thanked him for that, because like I said, he wasn't a man of war. He was really, he wanted peace, and he just wanted to take care of his people.
He was a man of survival.
yeah.
Well, so I guess wrapping the whole podcast up, is there anything else that you would like to, speak about, or have people, really know about the whole topic, or that we didn't really discuss?
I would just like people to know that the story's out there, and that you can look it up and you can find all the sources. You know, like I said, you can start with Cecilia's. There's Abby Winnicott's book. You know, there's just more out there. I think Meeker, is it Jerry Meeker? One of the
Ezra
Meekers.
Meeker.
Ezra Meeker writes about, you know, Leshi's tragedy. You know, he has from his accounts. So there's a lot of information out there that you can get that tells a little bit of every part of these stories, you know, that would help you to pull it all together, especially like with the timeline.
Yeah.
You know, people have to write different perspectives of it.
And I think that's kind of the important piece here is to, you know, situate the Mashel Massacre in the broader context of American colonization and the treaty wars. I mean, because, you know, I think that context surrounding it is really helps it allows if you're learning about it to develop a much more comprehensive understanding of what was going on at that time, and also that, you know, it wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a kind of a systematic strategy in attempting to end this war or end the treaty war.
Yeah, because there's different parts. Like if you look at Cecilia's book, they're broken down. You know, she has the Nisqually My People, but she also has, you know, she does have the one of Leshi. She has one on the internment camps.
Yeah, this one's pretty good too. The
Yeah.
Tears of Internment.
Yeah, and Stolen Land, you know, so there's a lot of, you know, the books she wrote are different subjects that you can go into if you're looking, you know, you go from the war to what happened at the internment camps, you know, it's right there, so you can read all of those to find out more information and more specifics on it.
Yeah, there's you know, along with the whole disease and plagues or whatever, that there's also the disease of war and greed. So there's a lot that I would like to myself dive into further and really understand more of it as well. But, you know, I really, you know, along with all of us, we really, you know, push, you know, we hope that you come to understand it as well. But other than that, would you like to plug anything else before we wrap it up?
No, I just think this is just a start, you know, this isn't.
It really is.
Yeah, this is just the start. And if you could go into all of this, I mean, you know, like I said, when you go to the treaty where I just say it started everything, because you can go to the medical, the education, you go to these different fields, the promises that were made. One of the things about the treaty with in Medicine Creek was that they received the hunting and fishing, whereas in the other treaties that wasn't put in there. And that was one thing I think Gibbs did. He took care of that. So it did help down the line, but there's just a lot of things. If you go into each one of those, you can see, you know, that can tell you a lot about what was going on at that time. I mean, there was a reason they put these categories or subjects in the treaty, you know, so there was a lot that if you look into that, you can go into all these subjects, you know, the same thing with the medical and the diseases and all of this that wiped out tribes. And, you know, there's just, and like I said, people don't realize in that, I was thinking of that in the massacre, they talked about when these people fled, you know, the tribal people, that because to avoid starvation, you know, you were actually butchering horses and eating horse meat, you know, just to survive. And, you know, I've even heard that with settlers when they, you know, traveled. But, you know, that's some of this, like I said, when the next generation, you know, would look at that, you'd be like, what? You know, as they're looking at their dear horse. They're eating horses, I mean, you know, so that's the part of it that you can go into all of these little things and see, you know.
They needed to do what they needed to do.
Right.
I mean, without that, I mean, shoot, a lot more of us wouldn't have been here. But,
Right.
But yeah, so we'll probably wrap it up there. And yeah, I really thank you guys for coming down, you know, making time for this podcast, because this is a really important topic. But yeah, once again, my name is Aztec Sovereign. Thank you all for watching and, you know, really pushing through, because I know this is a very, you know, tough topic to really speak on. And I thank you, and I thank you, Corey, for joining me today. And yeah, you all have a wonderful day. Hoyt.
Thank you, Aztec.
Yeah.